Welcome back to the Comfy Chairs, a podcast from 123 Limited. This is your host, Kate. I've had the pleasure of hosting Amber Johnson twice this year for in-depth conversations about the power of questions and the practice of appreciative inquiry. By their very nature, questions and inquiry involve other people in conversation. My guest today is a colleague of Amber's, so it seems logical for us to explore what can happen when leaders engage their employees in conversation and invite them into the process of co-creating the work experience. Patrick, thank you for joining me in the Comfy Chairs. I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself before we dive into our conversation.
Thank you, Kate. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. As you mentioned, my name is Patrick Farran. I am the co-founder and CEO of Lucem Group. Grew up in the Chicago area, now live in Indiana with my wife, and we've got 2 young adult children. I'm happy to say more as relevant here, but we do a lot of organizational development work and executive coaching in my work.
Yeah, I was really pleased to hear from you after Amber Johnson appeared. One, she's so charming. Any colleague of hers is someone I want to meet. But having the opportunity to do a deeper dive with another organizational development professional into these important topics around how we engage employees from a leadership and organizational perspective into what the workplace and the workplace experience is like. It's always timely in my mind, but I feel with so many of the headlines about return to work, what I can only call the farce of the idea of quiet quitting or any of those other fads that are out there, I think having a conversation about how do we have the conversation about work is very important right now, particularly as we come to the end of what I know for a lot of people has felt like a really turbulent year, professionally and personally. So where I'd like to start, Patrick, is regrounding in what is that simple, and simple is probably a little far-fetched for this, but for the concept and the practice of appreciative inquiry, beyond the core idea of anchoring ourselves in what has worked before. How do you define and apply the practice of appreciative inquiry?
I appreciate the question. So I would say appreciative inquiry is a strengths-based practice and discipline where we focus on the best of, and that's the best of us as individuals, the best of us as the collective within organizations and teams and so forth. And when we focus on those elements with a lens of appreciation, and hence the etymology there, and as well as the questions that we seek to understand and focus on, that helps us form in that direction. In other words, what we study and what we ask, the questions we ask, shape what we eventually become and lead into. And so if we ask positive questions and focus on when are things at our best and so forth, that allows us to think more generatively than when we're coming at a place from more traditional deficit-based thinking where we tend to get caught in a rut or toxicity and this negative spiral that's very, very common.
Yeah, I love that idea of shaping what we become. And I think it's important to start with that idea of where are we trying to go. I know that a lot of your work, I referenced my earlier notes, has to do with not just mindfulness, but also centering on purpose. How do you think leaders can get clear on purpose before they enter into those conversations, before they start being appreciative, so that they are shaping toward what we're all there to do?
Yeah, it's sometimes it's ultimately about being mindful first and foremost, and it may not necessarily be a sequential thing. I was just having
Mm-hmm.
a
Mm-hmm.
discussion with one of my executive coaching clients this morning, and they were feeling a little bit unmoored
Uh-huh.
from their current work and
Yeah.
some of the service that they were doing in their industry and some of the practices and so forth. And we talked about, he was familiar with the work of Viktor Frankl's Man's
Oh,
Search for
yeah.
Meaning and Friedrich Nietzsche, who both spoke of the fact that, and I'll paraphrase, but if we have a big enough why, we can endure anyhow.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for those who may not be familiar, Frankl researched Auschwitz survivors in the Holocaust and found that folks that really were clear on what they were living for and what was waiting for them outside had a higher degree of survival coming out of that because they were centered in their purpose. And so there's some powerful implications from that research,
Mm-hmm.
from decades of research, really. Uh, and so, to your question, in an everyday context, sometimes it's ultimately a question of just pausing and reminding ourselves why we're doing what we do. My conversation with my client this morning centered around the fact that sometimes there's a lot of hair that sometimes comes with things, right?
Yeah.
There's going to be in important work we're doing in my client's field. He's in a medical
Okay.
niche, and we talked about the fact why he originally got into that field. You know,
Yeah.
it's to save lives and impact lives, right? But he was frustrated with some of the politics with that he has to contend with. He was frustrated with some of what he perceived as organizational greed, for example, and that was wearing
Yeah.
on him, right? And so when you can center on your purpose, that can allow us to tie it back to persevere core. If we're really focused on what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, that can help us deal with and sometimes, you know, create a little bit of a shield or a buffer to those things that may come along, the cost of doing business, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are some inherent things within industry organizations or just those it is what it is kinds of things. But the way we deal with those doesn't necessarily need to succumb to those pressures. And so, if we can center on our purpose, that can be a really powerful antidote towards um, combating some of
Mm-hmm.
those frustrations, if you will.
Mm-hmm. That example with your client, it's it's even a step beyond centering on purpose. It's recentering. I think it's
Exactly.
important for us to acknowledge how iterative um, all of this is. The appreciative inquiry, focusing on purpose, searching for meaning. It's not one and done.
Correct.
And recognizing that that purpose can evolve over time as well. And that as we are looking back in order to create whatever is new, we'll have more and more data and hopefully more and more success and wins and good things to build on. So it's this very you use the term generative thinking. It's also very evolutionary and
Hmm.
revolutionary, and it's about continually bringing forward what matters and where we have been our best
Right.
as well. Now, you mentioned you do executive coaching. Um, you have. I'm really excited for you in this. You told me when we first met that you were in production on a book called The Intentional Executive.
Mhm.
And we'll have some time because I do want to hear more about the book itself. But that idea of intentionality, I think, is central to our conversation today because co creation, our topic, it does require a leader to proceed with intent and for clarity and with clarity. So, what I'd like us to move our conversation toward is this idea of kind of what is co creation? Why does it, I'll be bold and use the word demand, intentionality? Um, and then I'll reiterate this, not to worry, but what are the mindsets that will support a leader in those efforts?
Yeah, great questions. I think I'll start with the fact, the mindset piece, if I
Mm,
can
yeah,
here.
yeah.
The I think it's really important to understand explicitly, and we know this implicitly when we think about it, but to really name this explicitly that people support what they help to create. How many
Yes.
times in life, from early childhood, when mom or dad says it's time to go to bed and we're like, no, we throw the tantrums and so forth, right? But if the question gets reframed to what book would you like to read before we go to bed, right? I'm honoring some agency with the
Hmm.
person. I'm inviting them into that. We're co-creating this bedtime ritual together instead of me mandating this is the way it's going to be, right? And the reality is we don't outgrow that innate desire that we had as
No.
children to have agency, to have voice and input. And just to, it's a little bit, just to preempt sometimes there's a sense that co-creation might be a little bit woo woo, or there's,
Mm-hmm.
some of the objections that we'll hear is that it takes, it takes a lot of time.
Yes.
And the reality is, in my experience, is if you don't take that time up front. You pay for it on the back end with
Mhm.
cleanup on aisle seven, if you will, right?
I love
And
that.
so when you invite voice, it's not to suggest that everything is going to be a democracy necessarily, right? But when you allow appropriate opportunities for people to express themselves, provide input to processes, input to meetings, input to the way they do the work, et cetera, that can manifest in any number of ways across a broad continuum of practices.
Yeah.
That honors your human dignity, first and foremost. It
What a
allows
radical
novel
idea,
concept,
Patrick.
right?
Yeah.
Especially in today's ethos, right? For sure. And it can be done in very simple everyday ways, but
Mhm.
honoring people's human dignity, giving them agency, giving them voice. And the reality, the business benefits, it makes, the formal leaders' jobs easier in the long run, right? Because like, once again, people support what they create, and they'll go to battle for those things, right? Because
Mhm.
that's their baby that they put that input into. Whereas if we develop things in a vacuum without that input, people aren't bought into it and so forth,
Yeah.
right?
It's a go fast to go slow.
Exactly.
And, or rather, a question I would have for the leader that thinks, well, I don't have time to engage my employees in X, fill in the blank, whatever it is. I get really curious then, well, what do you think your job is if
Right.
it's not to do that? And I do think the work environment has created, we've glorified the player coach, right? We have overloaded managers with individual contributor responsibilities, and it's made it so easy for managers to do this very human thing of forgetting that their core job is managing people. People are not the interruption, that the work of leading is to get people engaged in completing the process, the product, the effort. And there are going to be some environments where you may not have the time, but those are going to be few and far between and not common to most industries. So I just revisited uh, my very second episode that my husband joined me for to talk about high reliability practices.
Mm-hmm.
He came out of the nuclear navy. There are times in settings like that, healthcare, aviation, uh, sometimes like construction and other things where we are talking about, human life, where maybe we don't have the opportunity to really like dig into the how are we all going to do this.
Absolutely. If my plane's going down, I want the pilot to take charge and get us there. Right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
But
So,
again, that's few and far between,
right.
and it's not every industry. So I think one of the mindsets I would uh, advocate for, that's the word, advocate for, is being humble about the nature of your work. So, back to you,
Yeah.
sir.
And I'll add that, to that when we have that humility as leaders, that we don't have all the answers, it's liberating,
So liberating.
right? Instead of putting that pressure that many of us do, to invite folks in and just acknowledge that's a great question. I have no idea. Let's figure it out. What do you think?
Hmm.
Right? It's one of the simple everyday things we can do to invite co-creation is, instead of presenting a solution, present the challenge and invite input.
Yeah.
invite their perspective.
Yeah.
It's such a simple but overlooked piece, and we often tend to solve for folks, and that's we derive, take away their agency when we do
Hmm.
that. So,
And the irony is, if the roles were reversed, the discomfort, the anger, the resentment that those leaders would feel is equal to what their employees experience.
for sure.
Yeah.
You're
Let's
not helping either party out.
No, definitely not. I'd like to back up just a little bit
Mm-hmm.
and get kind of nuts and bolts, very basic, and define the concept of co-creation.
Mm-hmm.
It seems evident just in the word itself: co, multiple people, creation, making something. But if you could help contextualize that, I think that'd be really useful at this stage of the conversation.
Yeah, and so co-creation again for some has a may have the I started to allude to this a bit ago and didn't finish that train of thought fully. Is that sometimes some people view that maybe as a little bit woo-woo,
Mm-hmm.
but the reality is it's simply in its purest form just inviting input from others in its purest form. And that can manifest in any number of ways, right? I mentioned one manifestation was presenting the challenge and not the solution, and inviting, right? Asking for perspectives before sharing yours, summarizing what you hear before responding. When someone disagrees, get curious instead of defensive,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a really powerful, it's a simple one conceptually. It's a really hard thing to do, right? If someone has a different opinion, sometimes our initial gut reaction is to be defensive. But the minute I can get curious and ask questions, this is one of Amber's superpowers, right? Is
Yes.
really asking those wonderful questions to invite that.
Mm-hmm.
It's disarming and it creates this just this solution and this space that you're not going to be able to create on your own,
Mm-hmm.
right? Practicing active listening in your conversations.
Yeah.
Um, if you're in a more of a transformation type of situation, and there's an org change, for example, looking for intentional opportunities to allow input windows into the process, and that can
Yeah.
take any number of forms, right? Helping folks job craft around the margins of their role, right?
I love
80%
that.
of the role you got to do X, but hey, in the margins, if you've got certain skills, and give them that agency to craft around their
Mm-hmm.
roles. So, and I could go on, but those are
Yeah.
some manifestations of that voice and input.
Thank you, Patrick. One of the things I hear you talking about is co-creation is not, by and large, is not a seat of the pants activity. And obviously, it's one of those, well, yes, Kate, of course, because we're talking about intent. But I think what leaders will find is if they front load some effort, and I'm not talking about months and months, but if you take an hour before a meeting, a few days before a meeting, and you think through where within, say, this change that's coming, can my people have a say? Let me get really clear about where we have flexibility and where we have to follow orders, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I like to talk about kind of judgment with asking about where do people have freedom and where do they need to comply, essentially. It's like, I also have a healthcare background. So one of the
Mm-hmm.
easiest things in talking about sort of broad changes a lot of times was for us to talk about what dress code looked like.
Mm-hmm.
If everyone has to wear closed-toed shoes, well, that's where your freedom kind of ends. You can't wear open-toed shoes because there is a rationale for it. It is for your safety. It is
Mm-hmm.
for reduction of infection possibilities. But you have freedom in the type of closed-toed shoes that you wear.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to dictate color. I'm not going to dictate brand to you. So work within these boundaries and have choice then. And I think that's the effort that I want to see intentional leaders make during change, is get really clear for people, not just the you have to do things, but here are the bounds of your agency.
Agreed.
to use your language.
I think the other thing I'll add is in addition to that practice, adding voice to a process.
Mm-hmm.
Articulate, here's what the process is going to entail. So you're being intentional with that process, you're communicating that process, you're letting folks know what to expect. And you might say, right, we want to hear your input. We can't
Mm-hmm.
promise we're going to be able to implement all your ideas necessarily, but we want to hear that. And that's important to us. And here's
Mm-hmm.
what that's going to look like. Here's how we're going to process it. And here's what you can expect thereafter. And just being explicit about that goes a long way in mitigating a lot of that
It
angst that
does.
otherwise gets churned up.
Well, and being prepared when you do that to do the final follow up. We kind of forget sometimes. I know that I have. I have been guilty of this, of asking for the input, taking what I can on board, having to set the rest aside, and then not. I know this is a bit of a cliche. It's kind of business jargon, but not closing the loop
Mm-hmm.
to say let's come back and I will tell you what's happened as a result of your input, and I will give you what rationale I can for why
Mm-hmm.
the other has not been taken on board. It I know a lot of leaders, again, they'll have the resistance to that because they believe it's time consuming. But the time that you spend, the minutes that you spend there, it gains you time across months, if not years, of people
Right.
resisting whatever the new or different thing is.
If you're lucky, they resist, right? And
Yeah.
if you're not lucky, they'll just leave the organization fed up, right? And then you got to
Exactly.
replace it, right? So it'll crop its head, and you'll pay for it one way or the other.
Hmm.
So if you can pay for it on the front end and invest it in a way that truly is going to sow seeds that are going to feel better ultimately for everyone, why wouldn't you want to do that? Right?
Precisely. Precisely. So you have um, totally gotten ahead of me in some of
I
the.
apologize for
Oh
that.
no, I love
Not
it.
as
I
off script
absolutely
here.
love it because one of the things I wanted us to discuss was how co-creation can appear time consuming.
Uh-huh.
And I'm curious if you think there are any reasonable alternatives to co-creation out in the world.
Well, I think I'd reframe it slightly.
Okay.
It's not so much that it's an you're doing co-creation or you're not, but there's a whole continuum that
Yes.
you can do,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so thinking about what's appropriate on the continuum, I noted a few sort of example behaviors. Some of those are very simple things you can just do in everyday conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just becomes part of your normal practice, right? And that once you habitualize those kinds
Mm-hmm.
of practices, it doesn't take that much to maintain them and invite them, right? So the investment of time for that, you're gonna get again to your point. Here's the jargon. You're gonna get the ROI on that pretty quickly, right? If
Yes.
you adopt those habits. Now, other things may be much more involved or extensive if you're going through a significant transformation type of practice, for instance. Um, but I encourage my clients not to think of them as binary either or decisions, but think about
Thank you.
where can you insert agency and voice? What can that look like? What's something that you feel comfortable with under the constraints that you have here? What are those constraints, et cetera? And then that just evokes more generative conversations than thinking, well, I can't allow my folks to have input on X decision
Mm-hmm.
because rather than fill in the blank, right?
Yeah.
Just asking those questions in and of themselves creates the seeds for a better solution that you can ultimately come
Yeah.
up with.
I like that because it reinforces that idea that this is not one and done. It is iterative. And in many, not all, but in many circumstances, the door for co creation can remain open. It's possible to revisit decisions that have been made in the past. Um, Say something like, and this is just, I like dress codes because they're universal, but they're also kind of low stakes.
Mm-hmm.
So we all experience it and it doesn't necessarily cut to the core of any one person's identity or experience. And say you make a decision about dress code, you do dictate that everybody has to have blue shoes. Well, maybe over time you realize that was unnecessary. There was no business rationale for it. It's an opportunity to go back and we talked about humility before, to admit that there was an opportunity to be different, to be more open, to engage people in the conversation. And that's a way to gain trust where it may not have existed before. So I'm not advocating to go back and redo every decision,
Right. We're trying to
rewrite
relitigate those past, right? For sure.
exactly. Definitely not, dig up past arguments and grievances. However, this sort of mindset, not only does it free you in terms of I don't have to know all the answers, it also frees you in a sense that I can make things better than they were before.
Right.
That if I'm not pleased with the outcome, if it's obvious to me that my team is not pleased with the outcome, if it's appropriate, if there's the time, energy, and resource for it, we can revisit. We can say, well, what has worked better before? What would be the better way for us to roll out this practice, to put this new product on the market? Fill in the blank.
Right. And I'm going to go back to a couple of earlier comments around, tying both the concept of appreciative inquiry and co-creation. Some common objections that we hear
Mm-hmm.
are, that we don't we don't want to ignore the problems, and we're not suggesting that you're
Mm-hmm.
ignoring problems, right? There, if I go back to the plane metaphor, for planes crashing, right? Sometimes you just got to take charge of a situation. However, that doesn't negate the fact that you can go back after those to do appropriate debriefs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in that
Correct.
example, the FAA is going to come and investigate. There's going to be conversations, presumably, right? You can take a look and unpack that. Same thing with if there's a more egregious performance concern, for example, right? Sometimes you're going to need to take more directive types approaches in the moment. So we're not suggesting that. Let me say it this way, it's contextual, right? So you need to use
Yes,
good judgment, but there's more times than not, there's an opportunity to do things on the back end if we didn't do it on the front end.
I agree.
And the other thing that I'll add is when we think ahead to what caused some of those challenges in the first place, when we focus on the strengths, Peter Drucker has a great quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it slightly, but his quote is something to the effect that the central task of leadership is to manage strengths such that weaknesses are irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And so the vast majority of the problems that we tend to experience with, whether it's a performance issue with an individual or with the team, et cetera, can be mitigated if we're setting folks and teams up for successful situations based upon their strengths. And oftentimes then it sort of negates the fact that, well, if I'm not good at X, can you ask someone else to do X and me to do Y, right? And plenty of times that's the easy answer, but we often we put people into situations. Again, we don't allow them input to say, "Hey, that's actually not my forte. I'd be more energized by such and such here." And when we can honor that, the realities, some of those things that we would otherwise set people up for, are negated as issues anyway
Mm-hmm.
because we're aligned with their strengths.
Yeah. You raise a really good point too, Patrick, that I want to highlight. Neither of us are advocating for only use appreciative inquiry.
Correct.
Uh, the goal is for this to be a well loved and well used tool in a leader's
Yep.
kit, because and co creation as well, if we
Mm-hmm.
lump them together as kind of fraternal twins.
Mm-hmm.
That yes, you may need, based on the context, circumstances, all the things that can influence the choices you make of how you're going to proceed as a leader. You may need to do other things. And co creation through the process of appreciative inquiry is going to get you good results when it's applied consistently with care,
Indeed.
and with respect as well. And that's something that just resonates for me earlier when you were talking about dignity, and respect. Not is it just something that I personally value being able to receive and to give other people. It is so core to how adults need to experience learning. And while I have a bias around this as a learning and development professional, so much of work is about what are we learning in terms of skill acquisition, in terms of from results, from mistakes, from successes.
For sure.
That if we respect the experience and knowledge that people bring, regardless of the nature of it, to the moment of learning, their ability to engage, expand, and retain and apply what the lesson is, it just exponentially, you're going to get better results that way.
Absolutely.
And it's one of the things that I would like about appreciative inquiry and the practice of co-creation is you're not just telling your people, you are showing them that what you know and are capable of, what you bring to this moment matters. You
Mm-hmm.
have something to contribute and I value you.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that we should say and demonstrate more often.
Couldn't agree more.
So I would like to hear a little bit more about your book, sir. One, I love the title because it's something, again, I think we need a little bit more of in our world. And I'm excited to hear that you have a book coming out into the world. That's always exciting.
Great. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. And I'll just add that the subtitle, which will lend a little bit more context, is it's a purpose-driven playbook to transform your leadership, your teams, and your results. Right. And so the central premise is that if you're intentional about the various practices, my co-author Melissa Norcross and I, we did our PhD work together in the Center for Values-Driven Leadership. That's where we met Amber some 10 years ago in that circle. And so we've distilled a lot of the best practices from decades of research that has preceded
Mm-hmm.
us, our own research and our own experience with executives in a number of contexts, and provided different frameworks, different stories to consider, a number of different reflection exercises, both for individuals and teams. We've built a pretty comprehensive tool set in the appendix that we use in many contexts with our clients that we wanted to make accessible for folks that they can sort of pull things off if they need to come up with common mission, vision, values, for example, on their
Wonderful.
team. Here's a framework for doing that. If you need to think about you may have heard the concept of developing user manuals, for instance, and that's
Yes.
Adam Grant and others talk about that construct. And so there's just a framework for how you can
Mm-hmm.
build the user manuals to make your work styles and preferences more explicit, for example. So again, you can co-create that work environment together and so forth. We've included a lot of those practical frameworks in the book.
Oh, that sounds fabulous. And you're expecting it to be out early next year, right?
Yeah, we should be early 2026. We're in our pre-launch campaign right now, and
Wow.
so that'll be out and available shortly thereafter.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So this is not entirely off topic, but I'm very curious. I would love to hear more about, kind of specifically what research you've been involved on in this space.
Yeah, so I actually did my dissertation research on appreciative inquiry,
Okay.
and married that up with a research question around work meaningfulness. And so I did a comparative longitudinal case study across 6 organizations. We did a number of appreciative inquiries, followed the results within the organization over a number of months, looked at what it did for. It included some work from Dr. Maro Lips-Wiersma on meaningful work and Amy Rishnisky, both giants in the field of work meaningfulness. Had the pleasure of having them serve on my dissertation committee, so used some of their frameworks in my research methodology, and looked at what were the work meaningfulness is a multi-dimensional construct. There's many
Please.
variables, right? And so we looked at what were some of the levers that were impacted. How did appreciative inquiry cultivate or hamper the
Mm-hmm.
one's experience of work meaningfulness, and what did that look like? And so that was ultimately the genesis for some of our research, and some of that has made it into our book. My co-author Melissa did her research question on humble leadership,
Okay.
humility and leadership. Um, and so she had Amy Edmondson, Dr. Amy Edmondson at Harvard, who
Yeah.
Melissa had when she was studying, doing her MBA work at Harvard. Agreed to serve on her dissertation committee, and Amy, as you know, may know, has done. She's
Fearless
created the
organization.
concept on psychological safety, for
Yep.
example, and so forth. So to be able to rub shoulders with some of the giants in the field, it's humbling to say the least.
Aw.
To have that firsthand research exposure in our programs was phenomenal. I know Amber did her research on global leadership and so forth. So
Yeah.
it's just to be around like-minded individuals exploring these various facets. Our program was centered on values-driven leadership,
Hmm.
corporate social responsibility, sustainability, tenants, and we did a number of projects and things. And so a lot of those references and resources that we were exposed to made their way in some form or fashion into the book. So
I like the mention of values in this space because I think so. Very early in my conversations with my guests, one of the things that I had a light bulb moment about is that not every leader, and this surprised me in the moment, I feel kind of naive for admitting it, that not every leader has defined for themselves what their values are. That we tend
correct.
to kind of be like, well, they're corporate values. I don't disagree
If
with
we
any of those.
if we can even name the corporate
Yes,
values, right? That's
right. Right. There is that. But, I don't really disagree with any of them, so that's fine. I'll work within those. But I think one of the things that's so important as a foundation, if you are going to be an appreciative, generative, humble, name all the things, all the good ways to talk about leadership, if you're going to proceed in that fashion, starting with a foundation of I know what I value, I know it's important to me, because then you can look at not just appreciative inquiry, but every practice, all the tools in your kit to say, do these align with my values? Um, you know, I I personally value humor, not
Mhm.
just let's have a good laugh, but just recognizing that good humor, kind of equanimity, will go a very far way in making everyone's life more pleasant. So through that lens, does this match? Does this fit within my values? Uh, I would say yes, because it's talking about what has worked, and there is a sense of good humor with that, um, and getting to celebrate and enjoy what has worked well all fits. But if you have concerns, leaders, about the time it could take to co-create, going back to these are my values will tell you whether or not it's a useful tool for you.
Right,
Or it may make you question, is this really what I say I value X? Do I?
right. Look at your calendar, doing a calendar audit,
Yes.
and does that align with what you say you value?
Yeah.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about what the qualities of meaningful work are? And I realize that is probably a
Whole
horrible,
conversation unto itself, but I would.
yeah, like almost unmanageable, ungainly question.
There's a
But
number of models out
yeah.
there. Dr. Lipswiersma's model, she talks about a number of dimensions. And one, she looks at she's got a visual, or she looks at what's in the center, which is your inspiration or your purpose.
Okay.
And then she has on these axes balancing. She draws it in the circle in one quadrant, talks about unity with others. Another quadrant is your ability to express your full potential.
Okay.
And the other quadrant is your integrity with self, the extent that I can be
Mm-hmm.
myself at work, for instance, without having to wear these false facades or masks. Um, did I say service to others, unity, service to others? I think I didn't
Mm.
mention that's the other quadrant that I didn't mention, right? And on those axes, she talks about the importance of on one axis, it's a balance between self and others. And then on the other axis, it's a balance between being and doing, right? And when I was when I first got introduced to this concept in one of her workshops, she talked about yoga is great, right?
Mm-hmm.
As for instance, but if all you did all day long was yoga, that'd be a pretty imbalanced life, right? You're focused on purely on the self and the inner and not on the outer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for each one of us to find meaning, and this will be different per person. It's episodic, as you alluded to earlier. It's not like you suddenly arrive at work meaningfulness and that's
Mm-hmm.
it. You've achieved it, right?
Yeah.
It's an equilibrium that you're constantly working to balance, and so it's balancing all those areas for yourself. And how are you, are you be able to express and challenge yourself and grow in intellectual ways, etc., to express your full potential in an appropriate way for yourself? Do you feel like you can be yourself at work?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of service to others? And do you feel unity with others, right? And that can
Okay.
all manifest in very unique and different ways for one another. So it's a very helpful model to explore a very uh, complicated, multi-dimensional construct.
Yeah, it is. It's again kind of unwieldy. And that sounds like it's a good way to get your arms around it. So I am personally of the opinion that a leader or leadership as a body does not bear sole responsibility for things like how meaningful is my work. I think the employee has a responsibility
100%.
to understand that. But in your experience, in the research as well, what, I don't want to say like what percentage does the leader own, but what is the type of influence that a leader has on a sense of meaning for their
My
employees?
personal position would be that the leader's responsibility is to help cultivate the environment
Okay.
to support that, because that's going to manifest differently for folks. And you remember those cheesy L. Ron Hubbard Dianetics commercials back in the day,
Yes.
right? It's sort of
I
like
am
that's
that
in the
old.
book, right? It's page such a right. We're dating ourselves here, but for those who know the reference, right? A lot of these things we talk about in our book, right? What is the responsibility of
Okay.
leaders? You're exactly right. We, are all of us have a responsibility for our own meaning,
Mm-hmm.
but it's making sure that we create conditions where we're treating folks with respect and agency, giving them voice, giving them
Wonderful.
appropriate support, but also challenging them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Helping them to grow, being receptive to growing yourself, and all those good things. So those are the kinds of topics that we explore at length. We have a good amount of breadth as well as depth in some of
Yeah.
those concepts that we explore. And I'd be happy to have further conversations with anyone that picks it up
Wonderful.
and might find it helpful.
Good. You know, this reminds me, it really resonates for me in how I have, like, the metaphors I've used to talk about employee engagement to try to help some leaders, again, get a handle of it. I equate it to a plug and a lamp.
Say more.
That we need, that our responsibility as an organization is to ensure that the outlet is well maintained and that the power is on, right? We've paid the bills. There's definitely electric coming into the house. The employee brings their lamp.
Mm-hmm.
And what we ask of them is that it's in good working order. The leader is there to show them this is where you put the plug in.
Mm-hmm.
Let me help you turn it on so that we can have the light,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm going to feel a little clever about knowing that your company name means toward the light.
Yeah.
That's how we keep the process of work environment, shared responsibility, and getting the right results is through thinking about what are we maintaining things so that people have the resources and the safe environment that they need to perform? Are we making it clear that this is what you need to do as the employee? Plug yourself in right here, engage in this way. And then are we actually taking the step to put the light to use?
Right. That's a good metaphor.
Thank you. Well, what kind of final thoughts do you have?
Could take it in a number of ways here. I would
For
offer for folks to think about what is one or two meaningful practices that they might want to adopt. What's perhaps one
mm-hmm,
insight that
mm-hmm,
this sparked for them today that they want to take into their work week to
yeah,
test it out and try it, right? Start small. Um, And as I mentioned, I'm very happy to be a resource with for anyone who picks up our book, looks at our content. My personal purpose and mission is to help folks be the best leaders that they can in their organizations. That creates the ripple effects and so forth. I consider coaching to be one of my callings. Um, Being the son of a lifelong educator, both my parents were educators, so forth. That's one way I feel like I can sort of pay that forward.
And we're on the lookout for the Intentional Executive when it launches next year. I look forward to being able to read and to share about it out in the world once it's out there.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you for joining me today. If this conversation sparks something useful, please follow the Comfy Chairs and leave a review. Those small actions help more people find the show. Got a leadership question you'd like featured in a future Comfy HQ episode? Please send it my way. I'd love to hear what's on your mind. And when you're ready to move from ideas into action, 123 Limited helps leaders build stronger teams, sharper strategies, and better talent plans. Learn more at 123limited.com. That's ONE23LTD.com. Thanks for listening.